afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our, what is it, the fifth and last of our lecture series. I think we've had a really interesting lecture series. Today we have Alain Thierstein from University of Munich, who is going to talk about the last component. But it's not going to be the end. The intent was not just to have a lecture series and then stop. The intent was then to actually do something with the lecture series. So what I briefly want to talk with you about is the follow-up. And Charlie and I just sat down and we have now agreed, I think, that April 18 is when we will have a follow-up conference. We're actually going to talk about what did all this stuff mean and what are we going to do next. So the intent was really not to stop. The intent was to move on. We're going to have a day-long conference, which is probably going to be a day long. We're going to invite several people here. We're going to invite business people here. We're going to really have a discussion about what can we do. All right, so one more thing. I want to, since this is almost the last lecture, I want to thank all these guys in the back who have allowed us to do this, who have gone from trying to do this to actually doing this fairly professional. So please help join me in thanking these guys for the work they've done here. I really appreciate it, guys. All right, as usual, it is online, and you can watch it afterwards. And everybody who's watching online, welcome. With that, I'm going to give the microphone to the Henry D. Epstein Professor of Planning, David Prosperi, who will introduce our speaker and talk a little bit about metropolitan regions. Dave.
Okay, so not really sure. Microphone. I don't do that, right? No. Okay. So it's actually a great pleasure to introduce our final speaker of this series, but I just want to go back a step or two. About 5 years ago, the School of Urban and Regional Planning actually wrote a mission statement that said, we believe that metropolitan areas are the fundamental unit of interest, that these are the engines of growth, that these are the social units that matter, etc. And that there was something, that these things were not viscerally known. We can't sense them. And that they are equally environmental as they are economic. And so how do we bring that together? And then the third part of that was, how do we even image it or imagine it? So about 3 years ago, I started doing a course on systems theory, and the third book, the imaging book, was some book that I found by this guy from Germany, who actually wanted to sort of pose the question of how do we understand city regions? How do we make them visible? How do we make pictures? The first chapter, I think, is called Pictures, Please, because there were no real good representations. And we use that book. We now have a short generation, 3 years worth of students who actually have read this book. I've never met Alain Thierstein before. 11:47 this morning. I've marked it down. But I know of him because everywhere I go to an airport conference, you need to find Alain Thierstein. You go to an economic development conference or a regional studies conference, you need to find Alain Thierstein. Here I thought he was some architect who drew about pictures. He's really an economist who works in an architecture school, who is quite the serious scientist and quite the wonderful consultant. Plays both sides equally well. And unlike previous introductions where you sort of list the reader, just go Google him. The point is that we have here, I'm sort of trying to figure out how to introduce Alain. And so the phrase that I kept coming up with as I sort of thought about this all day, was planning rock star. Okay? And I'm just going to leave it at, I'm going to introduce Alain Thierstein from the Technical University of Munich, who will do the last talk in this series.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for the introduction, for the nice flowers, the fresh flowers, David. Well, actually, I'm not going to talk about spatial planning, as you may think of. I'm not talking about governmental planning. I'm not talking about technicalities, but I'm going to talk about what else is necessary, that we go beyond what we already know. And sometimes we believe that what we know has little effect, or not the effects that we first had in mind. And one thing, of course, when we talk about spatial planning, spatial urban or regional development, is of course that we always complain about the lack of recognition of these disciplines. It's not so important as employment policies or social policies. So it's always a second or third rated policy, and it never will change. But the only thing is that we can make it or render it more visible, more appealing to people, and that has to do with the function of communication. And therefore I think it's very important that Jaap, you organized this series of lectures, and so I'm very thankful that I'm here presenting some of my ideas. Well, this slide here shows a little bit of my analytical background. It tells you that it is companies and their relation among each other and their outreach in order to produce value added that is shaping not only our trade or exchange structures, but shaping space finally. And it seems, of course, odd to certain planners because they only think in terms of use, zoning, and deploying infrastructure. So one very important interrelatedness, one circle that is important in my analysis is, of course, to look at these three broad issues that work hand in hand. And that is of one side, it's about competition among locations. And of course, it's not locations that compete among each other, it's of course firms that compete with other firms, and certain firms tend to locate at certain locations. So there is a concentration in certain locations, and then finally, if you aggregate everything, there is of course something like competition among locations. But public authorities hardly compete among each other, so there's no official market for public authorities to compete. But of course, what these competitors, the firms and their locations do is, of course, they shape spatial structures. They shape the spatial situation in the sense of settlement patterns that develop out of where they locate, what kind of amenities and infrastructures they need. And finally, at the end of the cycle of the day, it is about public finance, because everybody pays more or less taxes or revenues of any kind, and this is what the public authority, the public administration needs: money to invest in certain activities. So this seems to be like a very simple circle, but most municipalities, for example, do not really know how this stuff really functions. If you invest in a certain infrastructure, if you develop a certain plot of land, then you have investment costs for infrastructure, but then you have, over the day, you have, of course, maintenance costs. You have the amortization of the investment, and then hopefully there is some use of what you do. There is companies or individuals that pay eventually some taxes, and then you have the influx of money, and at the end of the day, you may think that what you did was worthwhile, also in terms of money coming in. But is there any calculation for the public administration that really looks after this effectiveness of what they do? Hardly so. And I think it's very important to know more about this interrelationship. And at the background of this question, of course, there is a huge debate in regional science about what is really our mode of explanation, what is going on. It is about how do we interpret global trends in spatial development. And there are two very interesting hypotheses being debated in these years. One is, of course, being put forward by the journalist Thomas Friedman, who works for the New York Times, in his book, The World is Flat, in 2005, you know that. And quite interestingly, in the same year, there was a reply, an immediate reply by Richard Florida in the Atlantic, where he said, well, the world is not flat, the world is spiky. Well, it's kind of a nice use of words. And Thomas Friedman says, well, the world has become flat, and this is because of two events. One is, of course, the deployment and the availability of information and telecommunications technologies, which are available, readily available all over the place, and you can buy them, you can hook on the internet, you can use satellite communication, and you can, or you would be able to sit any place you want in the Alps or at the shore, at the beach, and do whatever you want. You can program something, you can consult, you can do whatever you want, you can even teach, you can work as a surgeon from the beach via your communication tools. And let's say the advent of all this was, of course, the August 9, 1995. I don't want to ask you, you remember this date and what happened at that day, but everybody that read the book by Thomas Friedman, of course, knows that this is like a symbol when the internet age became alive. This was the date Netscape issued their first shares, the initial public offering of Netscape. But then I ask you again, Netscape, who? So Netscape has gone. So the time is moving ahead very quickly. So that is what Thomas Friedman says. Information telecommunication technologies and the end of the old communist Cold War system opened up the market for hundreds of millions of well-educated people who use the ICT opportunities. So in a way, the playing field of competition has been leveled through all this. So it's not important where you are, but it's important what you do. And then Richard Florida replied and says, yes, you're right, Thomas. It's absolutely correct what you're describing. But the thing is that you talk about information. And I, Richard Florida, talk about knowledge. And there's a big difference. So information, of course, can be downloaded, can be used from the internet, but knowledge only is being created through the direct interaction of people. And this is something very, very different. And images like that, and these are the indicators Florida uses to show where, let's say, the attractiveness, the productivity of interaction is going on. The light emissions, for example, here in Europe, or use the patent statistics where you see only very limited spikes, so to say, on a global map, where patents are produced or filed in rather large amounts, or you can use scientific citations and other indicators. So at the end he says, it's not about information, it's about creating knowledge. And knowledge, the creation process of knowledge has to do with the interaction of people. And this happens not everywhere, but only at certain areas. And these are the metropolitan regions in the world. So these are the spikes. There are only very few spiky places. There are the valleys in between and are the lowlands. And this is a process which undergoes a way of cumulative causation. So it's the urban hierarchy, the global urban hierarchy is getting spikier or more spiky, and it's not getting flat. So then, of course, you can understand I will more subscribe to the latter interpretation of the world, and that is what our research also shows. And it is about knowledge, the knowledge economy shaping spatial structure. Well, there is a definition of the knowledge economy. I don't want to read it aloud, but you can follow. It's about highly specialized knowledge and skills, which is strategically combined along a value chain in order to create innovation and sustain, of course, competitive advantage. This is a notion which comes from Michael Porter in the 90s. So what is this a knowledge economy all about? In my research, we try to distinguish three main sectors of the knowledge economy. One hand side, it's the advanced producer services. I just show some definitions of that. Then you have the more manufacturing side of the knowledge economy, high technology enterprises. And of course, you have a third, let's say, pillar or leg. That is universities, research institutions, mostly public, but also privately funded. And our research deals with how spatially, how do these sectors, the advanced producer services, APS, in abbreviation, and high-tech, how do they locate? How do they use locations? And how do they deploy their value chain over space? Well, the knowledge economy has, well, the two main sectors. You see the subsectors here. I don't want to go into details. Maybe for some, you see also it's also design, architecture, engineering. So there's also symbolic knowledge, very important. And the main characteristics, of course, of advanced producer services and high technology services, that the production of knowledge is the basic capital that you need for doing stuff, for innovation and producing value added. And using indicators, that is a above average share of people using or working in research and development and stuff like that. So the idea, of course, is that if we try to analyze the dynamics of space, especially if we would like to draw conclusions afterward what planning should do. So this is an important thing to me. As being not a planner, but working with planners and urban designers, it's always that you look at the facts first. But as David said before, these kind of facts are sometimes hard to grasp because we have a relational perspective that is constituent for urban development today. So one city, one urban area is not, let's say, to understand from within itself, from within solely. But the cities or urban regions are always linked with others. It always has been. It always has been the exchange which determines the node, the performance of one node in the network. So this is a perspective that we call the relational perspective. But the relational perspective has two very different components. It's like the flip side of this coin. So one is the competency of, traditional planners, if you may, if you allow that I use that word, traditional planners. It is the physical side of this relational perspective. You deploy infrastructure, technical infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, social infrastructure, cultural infrastructure. That is the physical side. You can see it. You build it, you design it, you build it, you use it. But of course there is a second part of it. That is the non-physical side. That is the relationships firms develop in order to generate and use knowledge for their process of adding value, for to be competitive, but for to be innovative. So there is always a physical side, but there's a non-physical side. And this physical side is very clearly described. You can even use GIS from a satellite view, or you can go down to the quarters of the city, to an intersection of the street. You can count the cars or the pedestrians. It is the physical side. But how these things relate to each other, what kind of interchange or exchange in order to generate knowledge are these infrastructures providing? And this non-physical side is not very much visible. Of course, there is maybe a relationship between where technical infrastructure is and where people may collaborate between them. But this is exactly what motivated me a long time ago, or years ago, let's say, to look at how do I make visible these non-physical relationships, because they shape very much, obviously, beside the physical, they shape very much space. And the theoretical background of this, that we undergo a phase in our society, in our economic development, that we call the rescaling phase. And rescaling is something that is very, very different for the municipalities or regions, because on the one hand side, you have a tendency to concentrate of certain local qualities, quality of living, within your quarters of the city. You realize that cities are not a homogeneous, uniform situation, but you have certain different colors and shades within a city. And you like to maybe even cater for these differences within the city, because there's people like to go there, other people like to have beachfront, or they would like to be closer to the intersection of a transportation infrastructure. On the other hand, you have, of course, a tendency to branch out, to be internationally connected, because your value chain, I mean, producing a service, producing a high-end good, is more and more dependent on your partners, on your suppliers, on your distribution net. And you don't do it by yourself. Even small architectural practices today, they have a specialist doing their models. They have a specialist doing their renderings for competitions. And they have maybe a specialist that do their accountancy and so on and so forth. Even the small practices have already a network that is even spatially spread out. They mostly not even sit at the same, in the same location, the same municipality. So on the one hand side, the concentration on local qualities, on the other hand, the expansion internationally. And how does a municipality, which still is bound with their competencies to their territory, to the boundary of their municipality, how do they cater for that? How do they deal with this, like spreading out? Yeah, you have this local and you have this international. So this is a very tricky activity. And on the conceptual side, what we do is to use this kind of conceptual model where we start with the functional logic. The functional logic is what drives the individual corporation, the individual company. They're looking for knowledge. They're looking for people that are able to produce these complex activities, be it in engineering, be it in design, be it in other aspects of the knowledge economy. And of course, they compete. Most of them, they compete with other firms. And these other firms, the competitors are not necessarily locally. They are internationally or situated in other continents maybe. So at the end, you have a very interesting combination of requirements for these firms. On the one hand side, they need to be close to others, close to produce knowledge, because knowledge is created through face-to-face interaction on the one hand side. You want to be close to a research lab, to university, where you have collaboration with some chairs, some institutes at the university. You want to be maybe close to some public authorities, which are important in regulation, for example. But then again, you don't do everything on the spot at the same time. You have your partners, and the high-quality partners may not be localized in your vicinity. So you have to have partners in Los Angeles. You have to have partners in Shanghai. You have to have partners in London or in Paris, in South Africa. So you develop as an individual firm, still following your functional logic. You optimize where you do business with whom, either within your firm, multi-location, multi-branch corporations, or with other partners that help you optimize your value chain and your overall performance. So at the end, you have this, at the outset, very contradictory requirements to be local, but which is the spatial proximity issue, but you have to be also relationally close to the ones that you deal with. Because every time that the issue is getting out of hand, you negotiate about a new CEO, you negotiate about a new contract, you have to decide whether this design will be followed or that design. So each and every time these crucial decisions come up, you go and meet these people, you meet. But you don't want to sit way out in the bushes. You have to be close where you can contact, if necessary, with the appropriate means of transportation, your partners. So that is why the intersections of transportation modes become so important. Hub airports, for example, are intersections, I'm talking about Europe, intersections of high-speed train with hub airports and regional light rail systems. So this intermodality becomes a very, very important issue for the knowledge economy. And so if you look at the individual logic of all the companies and aggregate all their locational behavior, then you see at the end you got something like a spatial logic. That is a logic where you see a polynucleated urban region developing. And what we call in this book, edited by Peter Hall and Kathy Payne, we call it the megacity region, the polycentric megacity region. And there is a definition in this book. I don't want to read it aloud, but four things are very important to me. One is the critical mass issue. To be able to compete in a knowledge economy, you have to generate a critical mass. This is not a sheer size issue, but this is how do you combine different competencies in a situation where you can access your partner, your collaborators within a short period of time. So critical mass, it's about connectivity. And as I said again, or say again, connectivity is about the physical side. That means transportation networks, more public transportation, rail systems, and the non-physical side, being a part of a network which is able to successfully put all the resources together for your service, for your product. And competitiveness, don't want to elaborate on that any longer, it's clear. But there is hope for the public authority. The first three elements, of course, are always something that is predominantly private issues. And of course, the fourth issue is something where the public authority can step in if they try to learn the lesson of the development. So the overall result is that we see an emergence of polycentric structures, polycentric megacity regions emerge. And these are some illustrations which has been inspired by Peter Hall. He first looked at the Pearl River Delta in China, where you see these polycentric structures 15, 20 years ago emerging. You have the same issue here around the Shanghai area, polycentric areas. Of course, you have a similar picture, a similar phenomenon in the US, emerging studies by Knox and Lang that highlight this issue. Southeast of England as the attractor in the UK, a polycentric structure where not Greater London alone is important, but it encompasses Reading, Southampton, Cambridge, and the like in the north. And here a picture from the Greater Pearl River Delta in China, where you already see the technical infrastructure, the physical infrastructures. There would be very interesting to see non-physical relationship of firms using this infrastructure. And what is going on behind is that the time-space configuration is being changed rapidly. This is a map, obviously, of Europe, depicting the travel time by train. And as you can see, the mapping is out of order in a way. It's not the geographical distance, which defines traditionally the grid of the visual representation, but it's the time. So the time between two nodes in this grid is the indicator to create this picture. And this is 1993, and you see, maybe if you can see it, there is a time compression between here in the north and south of Paris, which is obviously due to the high-speed train which has been developed in France first in Europe. So it can be shown. And the projection for the next years to 2020 is this. So I go back for reasons of slow motion. So slow motion, the next 20 years, something like that will happen. So it's quite interesting, and you can tell where companies would like to locate, where employees in the knowledge economy would like to be, because interesting jobs are going to be there. And because interesting jobs are going to be there, interesting people are going to be there. Because interesting people are going to be there, other interesting people are following. So other firms are following because interesting people are there. So there is kind of a positive cumulative causation. And accessibility is, or what we call connectivity, is very important. Here again you see a slide from Europe, global connectivity by air, recently published by a Swiss research firm. For Europe, the darker blue, the more connected globally these areas are. And something interesting is developing what we call in Europe, this whole area here, it's called, where the dark blue is located, the European Pentagon. So this is an area, it's an acronym, or it's a metaphor that stands for the global heart of Europe. That's where the buzz is. That's where the future is going to be within Europe. That's where the highest connectivity, physical connectivity, is being concentrated. And you see, the lighter the red gets, the less connected the areas are. Quite interesting, the change in the last years. Dark blue again, increase in connectivity, light red, decrease in connectivity, and of course, the less connected areas, they're catching up a little bit, and the others are trying to remain stable. I go back once, you see here the state of the situation 2010, and then the change this year. So obviously you can say that over the years there is also a tendency of firms of the knowledge economy to locate themselves, or at least have some branches in the areas where the connectivity is highest. And the result of this polynucleated situation is, of course, that it is very hard to detect really what are the boundaries of this polynucleated megacity region. Because it's, of course, a kind of a amalgamation of different typologies of space. Of course, you have something like the central business districts, which still are important in some of these areas. You have something like semi-rural areas, which also are formed a part of the megacity regions. You have traditional airport regions, or you have new urban landscapes, which are something in between the highly urbanized and the less semi-rural areas. You have something in between, and obviously this part of Florida seems to be like a new urban landscape where you have an urbanization which you don't know how to call it. So the question arises then in our research, what future for spatial planning? I mean, spatial planning always will have a future, of course, because as long as there is people, they try to plan their lives personally, and if there's many people, of course, you have to organize this in a more collaborative and aggregated way. And maybe this picture is taken around Zurich, and it tells you a little bit in a colorful way all the issues that you have to bring together. What is this? Is this an area of identity? Do you want to be there? Or you don't want to be there? You like it, but it's necessary at the same time. So there's an interstate highway in the back. There's technical infrastructure. And there's a shopping center. This is the entrance into a large shopping center. And then if you look at the airport region of Munich, for example, and I look at the effectiveness of spatial planning, regional planning in this case, then I see at the center, you see the city of Munich, you see one of the ring roads, and you see in lighter color, you see the public transportation axis. And you see the airport, International Airport of Munich. And what we depicted here is, in dark blue, those communities, those municipalities that grew the strongest within the last 15 years. It's only a selection of the results. The blue ones that are the ones that grew the strongest. And quite interestingly enough, you have a strong growth between the city of Munich and the airport of Munich. So it's an airport corridor that is emerging. And the light red color indicates what the regional plan has in mind for growth. It says, well, the airport should grow, of course, but it should spread its growth evenly around the airport. That is what shall be. And in blue, it's what's going to happen. And the overlap is very small. Top left of the airport symbol, you see a dark red, where, of course, there is a growth. This is the city of Freising, for example, for the ones who know the area a little bit better. So this is only an indication that sometimes, or very often, to my mind, regional planning is catering for something which is not corresponding to reality. So either you can ask, well, should we adapt reality to the plans, or shall we? I'll leave it open to you. So these are the results finally. These are the results finally that we end up with this kind of suburbanization. Might be nice. The white stuff here is snow, actually, for the ones who are not very familiar with snow. So the question, of course, is territorial governance. How do we manage, organize our megacity regions, our polynucleated, polycentric structures? Well, I did not come to bring a solution because I'm not the expert on that. I only want to recall again what is the basic idea of looking at the knowledge economy as the driver for spatial development. And it's a very interesting framework that I use in my talks quite often. On the left-hand side, you have all kinds of input factors that you can vary from spatial scale to any you want. It's the normal factors that you would mention if you talk about local development, regional development, accessibility, and so on. Even social equity is mentioned, but this is not important. I mean, these are basic features, but it's not enough to understand what's going on. This is the input side. Output side on the left, on the right-hand side of the slide, this is what you are looking for. And these are basically two elements, two processes. It's the development of human capital, which is very hard to steer, to organize in advance, ex ante, so to say. And it is the development of the knowledge-based industries. And there's one feedback loop. And the feedback loop is about organizing capacity. And this indicates that there is, of course, a issue for public authorities, but not only public authorities. It's an issue for stakeholders in a certain territory, in a region, in a polycentric megacity region, that you can do something about it. But how do you do it if you would like to have an impact on something you don't see, you don't sense? And that's why we came up with this program. And this is a program, not a solution. So read this book carefully, if ever, but read it not as a recipe. Read it as a program. That's why there is an exclamation mark at the end. Making megacity region visible. This is a program. You have to work on that. And I'm not sure what the outcome will be. But this slide indicates that it is a collaborative effort. There's different actors, finally, that are implied, and there is different spatial scales on the horizontal axis, especially if you look at what is needed for to develop the knowledge economy and the regional or local competitiveness. Then, of course, most of the regional promotion agencies always talk about functional aspects, talk about the creative labor, so the creative city, accessibility, or we have to establish a university or a branch of a university, then everything will get better. And if you talk with architects, they're more on the morphological side, but that's their issue. We have to have urban quarters, we have the nice atmosphere, or other qualities that, of course, spread over various scales of the area. And then, of course, you have something that is very important but hard to associate with a certain discipline, the perception, the image issue, the feel and look of a city, of a quarter of a city, for example. Who is responsible for that? Is it public authority? The reputation of certain activities that you have, or the reputation of the overall. And then we did a survey, which is not representative in a way, but we organized an international workshop a couple of years ago with representatives from metropolitan regions in Europe, and we asked them exactly what is indicated here. You see a whole series of factors, of fields of activity, which might be key activities for public authority. What do you think important to attract talents? I mean, this is the notion of Richard Florida, meaning that what are we doing that our knowledge economy gets boosted and talents are attracted to my location? And then please indicate on what scale do we think that we can have an impact or a handle to improve these activities. And of course, lots of the respondents said, well, it's a city, it's a town level. Others said, well, this is specifically Europe. It might be fully different, of course, in the United States. But it's a nation state. Quite interesting. Nobody made the European Union responsible for any of this. So this is quite interesting in these tough times for the European Union financial crisis. But interesting enough, it's the public transport, number 2. Public transportation. There is, of course, a multitude of stakeholders responsible, and public transportation is one of the key issues to organize the megacity region. So in the remainder of my talk, I would like to shed some light on the issue of the image and visible and the perception. And I think it's one aspect, one approach is, of course, to look at perceptions. And what we did in various projects is to look simultaneously at inside out and outside in perception. We finished a project for a smaller region, the Lake of Constance, which is in the eastern part of Switzerland. Lake of Constance is the lake that is in the middle between Germany in the north, Switzerland in the south, and Austria in the east. And there was a region, or still is a region here. You see the municipalities and the names. Probably the most well-known is St. Gallen, where it's an old monastery. Architects may know the monastery plan of St. Gallen, which is the first plan of having a city idea. And there were two separate planning regions, and one region, one institution that covers the economic promotion. And they said 3 years ago, let's join forces. There's no effect to be separate. Let's join forces. And they did a competition asking for somebody who is able to produce something like a portrait, that's what they call a portrait of the region. They were fed up with the usual statistics. They had enough of structural analysis. Everybody knows how many employment, where the companies are, and so on and so forth. We know that stuff. Everybody knows it, plus minus, yeah, you know the changes. But this is not interesting. Interesting is if something that tries to grow together, because you see there is a commonality, there's a functional region that has something to do with each other. How do we perceive this new area? How do we really get to grips with the challenges that lie ahead? And one thing is what we did a Google research. We asked Google, well, we typed into Google using the German version of Google and the English version of Google. We punched in all the names of these municipalities which are now organized or grouped in this new planning region. And the result is that, of course, what everybody thought, the most known city, St. Gallen, came out the strongest. The most hit, of course, are the ones that are have the largest diameter here. So this is something that represents more or less, in a very sketchy form, the self-perception of the region, of course. Everybody knows St. Gallen is the most important area within this region, and of course the German Google research analysis show exactly the same. But if you change perception, you step out of the region, you take a perception from outside in, using English as an indicator, proxy for, well, the outside perspective, then you see on the first hand there's much less much less hit on the internet pages, but also the relation between the different municipalities to the larger municipalities. St. Gallen is changing. So on a international scale where you speak English and not German any longer, it is, of course, the city of St. Gallen which is really the dominant issue, if there is an issue at all. And then the third thing that we were doing is to put into perspective the region of St. Gallen with their neighboring metropolitan areas. And this is the result of that kind of endeavor. And it's quite interesting that you see, of course, St. Gallen being located here. That is the Lake of Constance. This is the four-country corner around the Lake of Constance. You see Basel, the upper Rhine Valley. And then what we see is, if you look at the potential positioning and branding and imaging of the region of St. Gallen, you see there's much stronger areas around their neighbors in Germany, like Munich. There is the metropolitan region of Stuttgart. There is the metropolitan region of Zurich. Even the capital city of Bern is much more important, always in this Google research terms. So this puts into position, into perspective, what people in the region always think of themselves. Well, we are the best. Well, we are fantastic. We have this and that. Okay, we have this and that. That's what we're interested in. We asked the participant of this project first to indicate in a map. I don't want to go into the details of the technicality of that, but we indicated two things in this map. Indicate on your map, this is the boundary of this new region, indicate where you think the region has its best in innovation. Where do you think the region is most innovative? In green. And indicate where you think that the region is well known beyond its own region, so from outside in. And you see first there is a mismatch. The innovation in the region is not located where people think the region is known the best. And of course, some of the knowledge or the image of the region comes from landscape, from tourist attraction, from the attractive landscape itself. And we did this for several activities, and this is just a wrap-up of the different maps that we produced. If you look at on the top left, you see it's here in German, but it's where we ask people, where do you think the region is most performing in the economy, economic strengths? So that's around St. Gallen, a little bit to the west towards Zurich. The knowledge region, where is the knowledge produced that is important for the region? So there's much more concentrated to the light blue spots. If you ask people, where is it attractive to live? All of a sudden you have a spread out all over the place. It's very attractive. It's a very attractive area. And everybody, well, it's an attractive region. It's nice to live here. Yes, but the knowledge is produced only in very concentrated areas. And then, of course, red, where is important cultural activities going on? And in yellow, in green, bottom right, you see where you go for leisure and recreation. And so at the end of the day, we produced, this is also important, we used these maps for interaction with the stakeholders. So there were the mayors, there were the politicians, there were the civil society organizations, there were people from the business side. And then we produced such a spatial strategy, it's not a vision, it's more like a spatial strategy, which tries to combine specializations within this new region. Where is my, let's say, which part of the region has a special faculty in a way, and which attitude or image of the region only can be conveyed if we put everything together and network the qualities against maybe our competitors in the closer vicinity or far away. And the interesting thing is that we, and the people that did that here on the down right, as indicated as a source, we did not just design this at our office alone, but we worked with the people, we developed, we produced some sketches, they were discussed, they were refined, and there was a constant iteration until at the end this picture came out, and everybody agreed upon this picture being published as the portrait for the region of St. Gallen, and so on and so forth. So that is, to my mind, an interesting, well, let's say, endeavor, activity, a project that helps to understand what is this program making the megacity region visible all about. So this program, this book, if you look at the table of content, deliberately puts together different approaches, different angle of the communication. So it's not something that is only reserved or allocated to planners or architects. We have, for example, one of my PhD students that did something about mapping the hybrid value-added landscape, show how you make visible the interconnectedness of firms, the interrelationship of firms cooperating in a knowledge economy. Another chapter, of course, in the book coming from Maurits Schaafsma, a master planner at the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam, was dealing about the importance of accessibility, physical accessibility by hub airports, international hub airports. Then we had a business consultant talking about the reputation issue, the reputation which is important for individual companies, but you develop a reputation for a region, how you deal with this governance, how do you deal with the functionality of your region, are you able to provide a functioning region for the companies you want to attract or not, or for the people you want to attract or not. This builds up a reputation in the positive sense, but also in the negative sense. We have landscape architects talking about experiencing urban regions, what kind of experimental approaches are to really sense the region, walking, using artistical artifacts, for example, visualizing in the sense of an architect who became an economist here said, well, it's about visualizing desires, not cities. So it's about the emotional part. And we have a interior designer and architect, and she was talking about, or is talking about, creating identity. What kind of elements you can use to strengthen the identity of parts that obviously are not belonging to each other by nature, are not a born region. So these polycentric structures are not born regions. They are regions because they have to settle certain issues together. And of course, one of the very eminent or prominent means for creating identity is to use public rail transportation systems today. They are able, through the design, through the way, the visibility that is through that is prevailing through the schedule, and the way the system operates, and so on, is a means for creating identity. And there's many interesting experiences and examples in Europe going on, in Bordeaux, in Montpellier, in France, for example, but also in Germany or in Switzerland around Zurich. And recently, well, not recently, but every year, the example in the Valley of the Sun around Phoenix, where you have a Metropolitan light rail system which is early, which is not connected to the international hub airport, which really looks and tells the story about the technical infrastructure and not a story about the easiness of access and this emotional side of accessibility. And that's at the end part of the program that we're still working on, and I hope I make some comments for you. I could be able to transform or transmit some of my ideas to you, and I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so what I sort of heard, I heard lots of wonderful things, but what I really heard at the end was a radical, it's good radical, different basis for planning. So in America, I'm not good? I'm good. In America, we sort of start from an ecological land usey thing. We start from the notion of place. We plan places within an environmental land usey system. And here I see chapters called Mapping Desires, which don't start from place at all. Managing reputation, looking at the economic system behind space and understanding it, which is a totally radical, different starting point. And the starting point obviously leads to the end point, to the plan that you make. And I don't know if that's a comment or a question. I think it's a bit of both.
You care to respond to this or comment on it?
Well, actually, I cannot comment on the word radical, David. Of course. Well, when I started as an economist, I had no clue about where I will stand today, because economics, as it has been taught at universities and still is today, is aspatial per definitionem. So space does not exist in traditional economics. So there is, of course, regional science and regional economists, but space has different characters. And one character, of course, is that space is something that is produced by people through interaction. And if the space is produced through interaction of people and this outcome is okay, then you begin to call it place. But if the outcome is bad and people go away and only the immobile remain. So of course, the place issue is always very important, very prominent. We did not, in a way, our program does not mention this very basic activity which has to be pursued, of course. But what we did is, using maybe the term of Manuel Castells, the sociologist, there's always a space of places, but there's an important space of flows. The space of flows, the interconnectedness of activities that redefine the qualities of a place within the system. That is what we try to understand first. So how do these nodes, which are locations or in the best case have places that people like, how do these nodes change over time, and how does the hierarchy of nodes within the network change over time? And this gives you an idea about where do we go, but not in a deterministic way, but where do we want to go if we want to have a chance, so we have to work together. And this is the part of the program. So to be short, of course, place is very important, but place is being shaped by things, by processes that I would say again, traditional planners and I mean architects as well, hardly understand.
You began with a statement that knowledge production is has to do with interaction or exchange, human exchange. And then later in your maps of St. area, there seemed to be a direct correlation, at least it was presented. The production of knowledge area overlapped almost exactly the cultural activity area. So my question is, how do you distinguish between cultural activity and knowledge production? In other words, how were those maps created? Because that relationship struck me as almost direct.
Yeah, I'll go back to the definition of the knowledge economy, and of course, if you look at the subsectors of the knowledge economy, there is the advanced producer services, and there was one slide disaggregating the services industry, and there's always some activities that fall into what we call creative industries, like design and architecture and related activities, which we count among the knowledge economy. And this is because, in general, these people that are involved in the creative industries, most of them have a high education, well-educated people, international experience, more or less. So that's what we mean by the knowledge economy. But the way or the specific the specific character of their knowledge they're using or they're creating is of course more the symbolic side. And the symbolic side is something which is very intrinsic to the individual person. So in comparison to analytical knowledge, for example, which of course can be codified and then you can use it also on the internet, and you can use video conferencing. But using symbolic knowledge is something that is so much tied to the individual person that face-to-face is so much important, and the quality of place and the quality of accessibility is so important. So there is an overlap, of course, between maybe what you term or what we term the cultural part of the region and the knowledge creating part in a region. Well, there's a whole series of studies, of course, looking at the importance of the cultural aspect. But then, of course, we always have to be very precise exactly what we mean. In the European context, for example, cultural institutions and the cultural industry is something that is very much shaped by public investment, public activities. Whereas in the US, as I understand, cultural activities, cultural investments is very much left to the private sector. So we have to cater for this different. But basically, structurally, there's of course a large overlap. And if you don't have a interesting or thick and diverse cultural activity in the broad sense, you won't have a knowledge economy that stands out.
Thank you. If I understand what you were saying, there's a difference between information and knowledge. And I think, the cost of information today is approaching zero, but the cost of knowledge in a knowledge economy is higher. But over time, I would assume that the cost of true knowledge should come down as well, where everyone has more access to knowledge as we get to deal with information. What I'm really trying to say is, over time, does this still work where there's such a premium on the knowledge economy, or is it going to somehow not hold, because I think we're going to grow rapidly? And then a side question is, I personally think it's access to capital and access to natural resources is the next wave going forward, not so much knowledge. I don't know if that's correct. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that was a response. But thank you for coming today to speak to us.
Thanks. Well, I would put it differently. I mean, you're right. The cost of information has come down to zero, and let's say basic mobile phones, they are almost worthless. So they have same prices as the global market for grain or plywood. Tends to be zero. But of course, the marginal cost for knowledge is increasing. And in the future, most severe scarceness is not natural resources, is not financial capital, but it's knowledge, the creation of knowledge. Because to create knowledge, you have to have educated people, you have to have the chance to interact, you have to have the right spaces to interact, and you have this process of cumulative causation. So you want to be and go where others already are and like it to be. And there's no scarceness of resources, of course. It's only a matter of price, and hopefully the prices will increase. That will increase our awareness about the scarcity of resources. And you use resources wisely because the price is high. If the prices are low, like gasoline, then of course you use gasoline freely. As the whole settlement structure in the US depends on cheap gasoline. So now the gasoline is getting, gasoline price is getting higher, and already there's an outcry several times in the last years. And last time I was in the US, I've seen on the TV the pain at the pump. What a great expression, the pain at the pump. There is no pain. The pain is if you're not knowing what to eat tomorrow. For some people it's important to go to the next grocery store using their car. They cannot buy any food any longer. But come to a close. The relative scarcity among financial capital, natural resources, and human knowledge is definitely with human knowledge, because you have an expanding demand for using knowledge to deal with our future, but you only have a very limited amount of people being able to create this knowledge, although we have an increasing number of population worldwide. But the people that are able to create the knowledge that we use, that we need, is limited, because there's so many demands for this knowledge, and there's only limited supply. So the relative price, I mean the marginal cost for having knowledge, generation knowledge, is going to be higher than for any other kind of capital.
Good evening. I'm pretty much on the same page with you. I believe that knowledge equals power in the hierarchy of these these global regions, and that the knowledge price will go up because of the fact that it helps distinguish the influential polycentric regions from the non-influential polycentric regions, and allows the accumulation and the concentration of capital within them, because the talented people from the less successful world regions will flock to these regions with the knowledge, with the power, with the influence, with the capital. And I think that focus on activity is necessary. We need to know what makes, for a region who wants to be influential in the world, they need to know what activities do the regions who are influential have, what knowledge do they have, and how do they connect their people to each other. And I think if we keep ignoring that and looking more at land use, or looking more at things that are located more towards land than actual activity, we're going to be lost, because right now the economy is based on movement and it's based on exchange of information. And I also think that an elite club is forming when it comes to these polycentric regions, where these regions are kind of closing themselves off to other areas like, Greece. You have the polycentric region, which includes Central Europe, but then Greece is right outside of it. And even though Greece is going through an economic crisis, while Germany, in the middle of this intense region of activity, is doing very well. So I think it's starting to create a dichotomy in the world economy when it comes to who is successful and who is not, who is influential, who is not. So I think the price of knowledge will go up exponentially as it becomes more at a premium. And I think that's what you were trying to say, if I'm correct.
Yeah, it's a nice wrap up in a way. So it's more like a comment, but I want to prevent to be misunderstood as an economist. Of course, I put an emphasis as an economist on the issue of competitiveness and competition among locations, which is something that many planning-oriented activities tend to forget or to misunderstand. But of course, even in regions where competitiveness in an international scale or in a national scale is rather low, it is a very interesting issue for the people that live there and would like to live there in the future. What is the future of my region? What is the image of my region? What is the maybe the if we talk about polycentric regions like maybe here in South Florida? What is the common project? Are there any common projects that may help overcome, let's say, the focus on individual municipalities or maybe on individual counties like it is here? Is there any commonalities in the sense of some projects, some issues, some burning issues that help maybe organize or devise a spatial strategy, something that goes beyond the traditional territorial boundaries? And now in these issues may differ from region to region in the US or worldwide, but definitely there is always a region. You cannot say, well, it's all fine with us, and even if the boat is sinking, we're all in the same boat. But there is some commonalities, where are the oars, for example?
I have.
Go ahead.
We say that, always built environment is the manifestation of social, cultural, political, economic values, everything. So we are observing cities, the changes. We are observing everything in the architecture of the cities and the planning layout. One thing that I observed that always puzzled me is that when you show that everybody shows Richard Florida's World is Spiky slides, we are always focusing on these skyscrapers. I haven't seen any other slide that didn't have the skyscrapers. And when I think about the skyscrapers, that phenomena started in the US, in the downtowns in North America, and it's the symbol of power, symbol of agglomeration. But when we look at it nowadays in Europe, in Asia, we see similar landscapes. But when we come back to US and look at it, actually the skyscrapers are not the most important things anymore. Actually, US is falling behind the skyscraper competition. And in terms of the agglomeration of advanced producer services, when you look at their clusters, especially in South and West, they are dissolving, like the companies are further moving out of the downtown areas. So what does this mean in terms of production of knowledge? I mean, is the US following another model here? How is it being manifested spatially, or is the epicenter of knowledge production shifting to other places? Do you have any observations?
Well, obviously visualizations work also with you, so that's why I use skyscrapers to highlight the idea of spikiness, of course. But you're right. There is cities where you have low rise building and high density, and you have high rise building and low densities, so this is not a correlation necessary. But what you're referring to is, of course, exactly what I was trying to convey, that we have a process of this emerging polycentric structure. So it's not necessary that everything is concentrated in the skyscrapers, which stand for maybe the central business district. Lots of activities moved away from the central business district to certain other nodes within what we call the polycentric structure. But these nodes are connected, have high connectivity with the traditional centers, or maybe sometimes even not any longer with the traditional centers. So it's very much important that you picture these polycentric structures as a network with nodes within this grid. But the nodes, the important nodes, are very highly accessible and show a high connectivity. And this connectivity today is mostly only provided by public transportation, in a denser structure, of course, by subway, but in a more looser structure by tramways. That means light rail metro systems that are visible, that work on level 0, because it's very important that people see how things are connected. It has a very soothing effect and reconciliation effect on the people's minds, that you see how things move. So it's a polycentric structure, exactly. So it's not the downtown area or the CBD any longer that is the only thing where power and our decisions are controlled and concentrated, but it is a polynucleated structure. But this only functions if you have the connectivity, the physical and the non-physical connectivity that binds, that ties the different nodes within a network that we call the megacity region together.
Professor, it's very interesting. This whole series is called Rethinking Planning in Florida, and one of the things that we've discovered over the last, I guess now, 8 or 9 months that we've been working on this, that we keep finding the land use cart in front of the horse, and our focus on land use is the framework for planning, and who does it seems to be a major obstacle to creating productive visions, particularly at the greater than local level. And what we've been struggling with is the sponsorship of planning. Our sponsorship is primarily at the local government level. We have, I forget the number, 128 in this region, municipalities, 3 counties, each have their own vision. We do have some state structure that purports to oversee it. But my question is, who's the sponsor of the kind of exercise you showed us for St. Gallen, and are there any analogs or that we could look to in trying to look at, is it a governmental function? Is it a public interest function? How do we find, because our local government planning is totally fixated on land and the value of land, and loses sight of the greater economic health and this region being competitive in the global economy. So I wonder if you have any insights that you'd share with us.
Well, there's many insights, but it's hard to generalize, and especially to transfer, convey recipes. I'm far away from bringing recipes to Florida. But one thing, of course, is sure that you put emphasis on the preoccupation here on the land value and the land use and the zoning, and this is understandable. This is perfectly rational in the context that how you organize your society in the U.S., but also in Florida and many states, in most of the states in the U.S., and that is the tax system. How does your tax system function? You have a very traditional, I would say, old-fashioned tax system that taxes are collected very strongly on the value of land. This is if you look at the history of the taxation system, this is something that is coming from agricultural societies. But you should tax things that are scarce today. Energy, for example. You should not tax labor. You should maybe tax financial transactions, but not land. But if your taxation system, especially for the municipal level, of course, is so much dependent on the land value and the turnover of land, because this generates income, then of course the whole activities that goes along with this is focused on the land use and the land value. It's a little bit different in Europe, and it's different in other areas. So by saying that, of course, this has a repercussion on the idea who is the sponsors, or who are the sponsors. My experience date back now for maybe in the late 1980s in Switzerland, where early 90s. There were 2 experiences, also in regions within Switzerland, small regions, where the initiative came from the private sector, from private individuals. They say they realized, as I said in my introduction, well, public planning so far is okay, but it's not sufficient to produce a functioning regional structure, and there is lots of issues that are not solved to our confidence. So the private enterprise and entrepreneurs said, well, let's set up a foundation in this incident, a foundation that deals with this issue. We bring together all the stakeholders. We propose a program, a process over the next 6 years. He established a foundation or a trust maybe that has a lifespan of 6 years. And he donated money, and he said, well, this will work if somebody else will donate the other half. And after 6 years, we'll take the balance, what's happening. And after 6 years, maybe it goes on or it's a failure, then let it be. That's a nice experiment. So, and in the meantime, from that period, early 90s on, I experienced several incidences in Switzerland where private activities stepped in lieu of public activities because public were so much bound within their own territorial logic that they were not able, due to different political reasons maybe of re-election and stuff like that, they were not able to step out of the box. So to be able, you have to step out of the box at a certain point in time. You have to step and think out of the box, and that's what we call governance. You leave government, which is okay, but then you step out of the box and you use or you try to develop additional mechanisms that are experimental. And in this case, it always was private enterprises. It was not the largest enterprises, small, medium-sized enterprises who said, well, we have to do something about it. Or maybe the Chamber of Commerce was a part of the whole area. But not all chambers of commerce. There are very conservative chambers of commerce. There are others, they are more innovative with younger representatives. So there is a variety of potential stakeholders that could take the lead, stand at the helm of such an activity. And it's very much dependent on the individual situation, and to analyze who might be the one person or the one group stepping forward. I think it's worthwhile to maybe organize a small workshop to think about who is potentially able to use his own personal reputation as a business person, as a universities person, and to invest a part of his credibility for the cause and the issue of the whole region.
All right, well, it's 7 o'clock. I want to thank the speaker and everybody else for coming. So I hope to see all of you again on April 18, when I think we're going to have to work on that last issue. Thank you.